Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. We continue today our study of the book of Esther with the second chapter. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was, and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This is the word of the Lord. One of the things that I would encourage you as whether it's an individual or as a family to consider as you read through the book of Esther is, how is the Lord working behind the scenes? We mentioned that yesterday. He's never specifically mentioned in the book. So how is God working? in all of these things? How is God going to work through sinners in order to bring about his protection, his provisions for his people? One of the Jewish girls becomes queen over all of Persia, that vast empire that we saw from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces yesterday in chapter 1, the whole kingdom. A Jewish queen, right? Not one of his own people that he chooses. The Lord is at work in this. All right, so let's take a look at the text to see what we see. So Ahasuerus yesterday, or Xerxes, his other name, is angry at Vashti's refusal. And so chapter 2, after things have calmed down, after he has calmed down, he remembers her. Now, what that exactly entails, hard to say. It seems to be that he remembered her out loud, like he's regretting what he's done, or he's mourning over how his queen is no longer by his side, whatever it is, because verse 2, the young men who are in his presence, who attend to him, who serve him, they speak, right? They come up with the idea of how to solve what is troubling the king. So they come to know of it somehow. So again, it sounds like he must have been saying something. And their idea. So challenge the kids, right? Ask your kids this question: what is wrong with this contest? Right? It's a beauty contest to become the next queen. They're going to take beautiful virgins from throughout the kingdom. So all the provinces, all 127 provinces, find the most beautiful virgins you can find, gather them here. They're going to be placed in the capital, in Susa. So I guess Susa, the winter home for the king. They're going to stay under the custody of the king's eunuch. So, I mean, a eunuch can't do anything to the women in his charge in that way. So the king doesn't have that concern over what his servant might be doing. And so Haggai is in charge of all these women. They're going to be given cosmetics, so to make themselves appear more beautiful, and whoever pleases the king gets to be queen instead of Vashti. We don't see Vashti anymore. So, again, what's wrong with the contest? Should be pretty easy to see. This is making all these young ladies wives to the king, as we're going to see later on in the chapter. And he's not going to serve them faithfully as a husband. You could probably try to make an argument in favor of the idea that a husband could be faithful to more than one wife. You could try to make a case for it. Personally, as a husband myself, I struggle to be faithful to my wife. Just one woman, right? That her needs would be more important than my own needs, that I would serve her and care for her rather than caring for myself. I struggle with that much, let alone to add more to that picture who take on that primary role of a wife in marriage. There's a reason why Christians talk about, right, Jesus' words in the New Testament, one man, one woman for life, as the picture for marriage. We're to serve one another. And typically speaking, a man desiring to have another wife beyond the first is not being done out of service, right? Ahasuerus is not doing this because all these young women need to be provided for. He's doing this, again, this contest to find the most beautiful wife for himself. So not a good starting point for this. Anyway, we continue. We learn about Mordecai. He was a Jew living in Susa who was carried away, right? His family had been carried away from Jerusalem when the captives were under Jeconiah, king of Judah. This is a reference to Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in 2 Kings chapter 24. We're seeing double names for a lot of people in this book. Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. We're going to see Esther, Hadassah. We got lots of them. So this is another. Jeconiah is Jehoiakim, 2 Kings 24. He is captured by Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BC, and many of the nobles taken away with him at that point, 10 years before the fall of Jerusalem will actually occur. So Mordecai's family tree was carried away then. His family never returned. When Persian king Cyrus sends them all home to rebuild, they should have returned. They should have gone home, and they didn't. The Lord works through this, right? We're seeing the Lord work through sin in order for good. And he's going to work through Mordecai staying behind. Oh, probably not Mordecai staying behind. Mordecai's father or grandfather staying behind, in order to bring about salvation for the Jewish people from the destruction that's going to be plotted against them in tomorrow's chapter. All right, so Mordecai, ends up caring for his cousin, right? His uncle's daughter, Hadassah. So her name in Hebrew means myrtle. Esther is Persian, star. Very closely related, it would seem, to some of those Middle Eastern ancient deities like Ishtar or something like that, perhaps. But so she's given, it seems like she would have been given that second name, perhaps even by the king. Who knows? That's not given to us here, but she's got these two different names, one Hebrew from her own people and one given to her probably by the Persians. She's an orphan, her father and mother having passed away. She's beautiful, lovely to look at. That description was given of Vashti before in chapter 1. Mordecai has been raising her as his own daughter, so he's an older cousin to her. The king's edict went out, right, that all these young women were to be brought in, and Esther was taken as well. So again, God at work, right, this time through beauty. Beauty is an idol in our own culture, right? And it's interesting. I encourage you to try to do a word study on the word beauty or beautiful sometime and just see how wrongly the idea of beauty plays out in Scripture so frequently. We're told our Savior, Jesus Christ, we're specifically told that he is not beautiful in form that we would look at him. I think that's Isaiah 52 and 53's prophecy. But instead you see the examples of beauty so often leading to destruction, like Abraham and Sarah, his wife, that whole thing with, you got Jacob with Rachel and Leah. It's again and again that we see this going on in Scripture. That could be a good word study to try sometime if you've never done that one before. So anyway, Esther's taken into Heggai's care as part of this harem, and she quickly, verse 9, pleases him and wins his favor. Again, the Lord is at work in this, right? It could be that Esther is a very sweet young lady. I'm not saying that she wasn't, but God is at work in this. She is being raised up among all the other virgins, even they're all beautiful, right? That's the whole contest. God is favoring her. He's heightening her among them. He has made her favorable in Heggai's eyes in order that, again, he will use this, he will work through this, even this wicked situation, to bless his people, to care for his people. And Persia by extension, right? I mean, the king is going to see this. The king, in theory, should be hearing about Yahweh in the future from his queen. She can tell him about her God that she worships and loves. So the Heggai, the eunuch in custody of the harem, he provides her with what she needs. He even gives her servants, right? There are 7 young women placed under her care that are going to help her, and she makes it to the best place in the harem. She does not, verse 10, make known her origin, right? Mordecai told her not to, so she doesn't. She doesn't tell them that she's Jewish. Now, they're coming from all the different provinces, so where they're coming from maybe not as significant, but could it have played a role in the king's decision? Perhaps, right? If he's down to 2 and he's trying to pick one of these 2 beautiful women for himself, that may have been a deciding factor. Who knows? Again, not a good starting point, right? Anyway, Mordecai would learn, he would snoop around, right? He'd come close so that he could hear from Esther how things were going. He wanted to keep an eye on her. He loves her. She's like a daughter to him. We learn that it was 12 months of preparation for all of these young ladies. And we are told that simply as though, right, the regular period of their beautifying, as though this was a normal thing in the Persian Empire. I don't know much about it. I don't know if history knows much about it, but the author of the book, who's unknown to us, seemed to think that we should have some kind of an idea into what was going on here. Anyway, 12 months that their bodies physically are being prepared. Could they have been learning things as well, like etiquette in the Persian court and things like that? Probably, but it's a focus again on the beauty side of things for these women. Now, each woman would be taken to the king one at a time, right? They would get a night with the king. They could bring with them whatever they wanted. So they get to bring something to try to appeal to the king, to try to please the king, because whichever one of them delights the king the most is the one that gets to be his queen. We should just already put it in place here. They're all going to be his brides, but only one of them gets to be his queen. That's the contest, and that's what's going on. So when they're done with their night with the king, they are placed under the care of Shashgaz. So that's actually like a demotion. They go into the second court. They go to the room of the concubines of the king, so lesser wives, and they stay there unless the king ever summons them by name again. So he's got to know their name. He has to have delighted in them enough that he bothered to learn their name. And I hate saying that, but a lot of these young girls probably never saw him again. How does God design marriage? Is this what marriage is supposed to look like? And I've hinted at it several times, right? This is not even close to what marriage is supposed to be. Even in a Christian culture, even in an Old Testament culture where concubines were had, there should have been more care than this. And so this is a struggle. But again, not a Christian culture. This is the Persian king. They're not Christian people. They're not followers of God. So Esther finally gets a turn. And she takes nothing except whatever Haggai, that eunuch that she has found favor with, he gives her, right? He tells her what to take. He wants her to win the contest. He wants her to become queen because she's found favor in his eyes. So he instructs her. She takes his advice. We're not told what he advised her to take, only that she trusted him and that it's going to be part of what works out to her advantage here. She does not go in until the 10th month. So we had 12 months of preparation. Now we've got 10 months of this contest actually occurring. If King Ahasuerus is receiving one of these young ladies every night, we're over 300, right? I mean, 9 months of 30, 270. So we're between 270 and 300 if it's nightly. I guess in hindsight, I can hope that it wasn't nightly, right? That he was just whenever it pleased the king to do so, in which case the number could be smaller of these young girls that ended up relegated to that role as concubines for the rest of their lives. However, in that role, they would be provided and cared for. It's not good. I mean, right? Just a bunch of women living almost like a nunnery, right? A convent lifestyle together. They are the king's wives, but that's all they are. They're provided for because they're his family. But it's not the lifestyle that the scriptures would have for a husband and a wife. I don't know how many times I've said that in this chapter. If it's getting old, sorry, I'll keep pointing it out, right? So this is the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign, so that would put it at 479 BC, and he loves her more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all, so she gets the royal crown. He makes her queen, and they have a great feast. That's the next verse, verse 18, right? There's a feast. We had a feast in chapter 1. We've got a feast here in chapter 2. Feasting's going to be prominent in the book, actually. This king likes to eat. Esther's feast, it's a wedding feast, right, of the king and queen. And so he gives as a wedding gift actually to his people. He gives gifts. He remits taxes, right? A tax relief because the king got married. People are going to be pleased with that. And royal generosity. He gives gifts to the people. He has been excessively wealthy and rich, but also excessively generous with his wealth. Again, even this is the flip side to the idea of the concubines. He's being generous and at least providing for them, although they probably would have had a more fulfilling life. I'm not going to say a better cared for life, but a more fulfilling life if they had been left back in their provinces and could have married one of their own people and had a family and so forth. But they would have been provided for. They would have not lacked any physical, the needs of this life in terms of food, clothing, shelter, and such. All right, so what we learn out of this right away is that this is going to advance not only Esther, but also Mordecai, because Mordecai is sitting in the king's gate and he overhears a plot by Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, that they want to harm the king. He tells Queen Esther. Esther reports it to the king in Mordecai's name. It's investigated, found to be true, and they're killed. Those two men are executed on the gallows. Gallows are going to come back of importance later in the book, and it's recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So it's written down in Persian records, and we're going to see that importance in chapter 6, when the king, almost just like in a moment of wanting to hear about how great he is, when the king has a chance to have his chronicles read to him, Mordecai's name comes up, and he'll remember he never did anything to thank Mordecai. And that's going to be important, again, chapter 6 in a few days. The other thing to note here in verse 20, Esther obeyed Mordecai just as she did when she was brought up by him. There's actually a problem with that, in the idea that a wife is no longer under her father's care. Esther should have placed the king as her highest priority and not Mordecai. The king's orders would be more important, right, as her husband, than her adoptive father's orders. And this is true in marriage today, of husband and wife both, right? It's my responsibility to take my wife as my primary relationship in this creation. The Lord is first. My wife is second, our children are third, and then it's other extended family and other relationships I have with people in this creation that come after those things. So, husband and wife both, right? To be entrusted to one another, to become one flesh, and that relationship seems to be lacking on both sides here. That obviously Ahasuerus with a whole harem of wives, but also Esther, that she is not having that full one fleshness with her husband as she ought to have.